Circling back to one of our top stories this morning, President Trump is set to speak to his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, today by phone in a push to broker an end to the war in Ukraine.
The U.S. leader is expected to speak to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after the call. U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, says Mr. Trump is determined to get something done. Top Russian and Ukrainian officials were unable to reach a breakthrough during their first face-to-face talks in 3 years in Istanbul on Friday.
President Trump's calls to both leaders will come as Ukraine accuses Russia of launching its largest drone strike yet, sending more than 270 drones targeting various regions, including the capital, Kyiv. The Ukrainian military says it managed to intercept most of the drones.
And joining us with more is Melinda Haring, Senior Fellow at the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council. Melinda, thank you so much for joining us. So what sort of expectations do you have for the call between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin? Could it really lead to that elusive breakthrough as the U.S. president seemed to promise last week?
Good morning. I certainly hope so, but I am not very hopeful. So we know that Donald Trump has a soft spot for Vladimir Putin, but he is starting to harden. He's getting annoyed that Putin will not he won't engage with a real ceasefire. Putin has the ability to stop the war in Ukraine, and he knows that. He called for a 30-day ceasefire, and Putin only put a 3-day ceasefire in place. So we see Donald Trump's rhetoric starting to harden and change, and I expect him to be much more forceful tomorrow in that phone call with the Russian president.
Melinda, just talks in Istanbul is hardly surprising, and the escalating violence in Ukraine. Really, how much leverage does Mr. Trump realistically have to push through a ceasefire deal? Do you see any incentives, politically, political, economic, or even military, or even trade for Russia to really accept a ceasefire now?
So I don't think the Russians want a ceasefire, and look no further than what happened over the weekend. They fired 273 drones into Ukraine, and the number of drones keeps going up and up. We know that the Russians want to try to shoot in 500 and overwhelm the Ukrainians' air defense systems. These are in their plans. But what can the U.S. do? The U.S. can do a lot. We do have options. We do have leverage. So President Trump has said that he could definitely tighten sanctions. The EU and the Brits are willing to tighten sanctions as well. So that's one possibility. There's not a lot of trade between the United States and Russia. That's definitely true. But Donald Trump could also decide to arm Ukraine to the teeth. That's always an option, and that's one that he hasn't pursued so far.
There are many reports, suggesting that Donald Trump wants a ceasefire very badly. I mean, I guess the question is, how badly will it translate into greater assertiveness as you were hoping for? Or do you think he'll agree to some of Russia's key demands, be it on territory, ending Western military support, and NATO membership, for example?
So I think a key point is that it's not Donald Trump's choice. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent country, and it gets to show up at the negotiating table, and it's going to have to sign on the dotted line. Donald Trump does not represent Ukraine. The reason why the talks broke down last week are two reasons. Number one, the talks weren't really real, and I think that the easiest way to put it is both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky needed to show that they were willing, that they were open to negotiating. Donald Trump had called for that 30-day ceasefire, and neither of them could tell the guy no. So they both had to show up. But it was really about managing optics. And then the technical reason why there's no ceasefire agreement is Russia doesn't want it, and the demands that it puts forth. So on Friday, it said, Ukraine, you must give up 4 regions of Ukraine that are partially occupied by the Russians just to chat with us. Ukraine, that's a non-starter for Ukraine. There's a lot of non-starters. Russia's going back to the negotiations that it began in 2022 in Istanbul, and there are so many non-starters in that agreement. So it's really hard to see how either party is going to make any progress when they sit down.
Yeah, so you say Russia doesn't really want a ceasefire. A draft ceasefire document from Russia may be imminent. I mean, Marco Rubio has said that. His Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, told him so. And so what will you be looking out for in that to gauge Russia's seriousness?
So the first thing that I would urge people to do is look at who Russia sends to negotiations. So back on Friday, Putin refused to come. If Putin's not there, it's not a real negotiation. So that's your clue number one, that Russia's not ready. But they sent low-level negotiators. They didn't even send someone who was high level and someone who has Putin's trust. So look at the negotiators for one. Look at Russia's behavior. If Russia continues to try to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses and it doesn't stop hitting civilians, that's another clue that they're not serious. So I don't see any clues from traveling to Ukraine, from looking at the map, that Russia really is trying to off ramp.
Melinda, I'm trying to get a sense of what Europe's place is, amidst all this activity. I mean, you mentioned, the continent briefly, but we also know the heads of Germany, France, and Britain expected to speak to Mr. Trump before his phone call with Putin. Are the Europeans and the Americans on the same page after that reported flurry of activity and meetings that took place over the weekend?
That's a great question. So I think it's safe to say that we see Washington and Europe increasingly pulling apart. And part of this is intentional. So Donald Trump wants Europe to pay more and do more for its own defense. And he's scared the Europeans into thinking that the Americans are not going to be there to protect them. And the Europeans have been free riders for a long time. That is factually correct. And we see them doing more. And they are scared. But the question is, are they moving fast enough? And at this point, it doesn't look like they are. What I'm really afraid of right now is that the Ukrainians are going to face a short-term gap this summer, and Europe will be able to fill its needs in the medium term and the long term. But I see a growing gap between Washington and European capitals when it comes to Ukraine.
And so what are you expecting to see from that phone call in terms of, say, reaction from Europe as well?
So the one area where I think there's agreement is on sanctions. There's a bill in the US Congress right now that is gathering momentum and steam that would really turn up sanctions on the Russian economy. And we also see that the Europeans and the British government are serious about increasing sanctions on the Russians as well. So I think there is unanimity on that point. We see a bunch of European governments saying that they're going to step up military support. One of the big issues, though, is that Kiev is able to make more of its weapons now, but it doesn't have enough actual money to pay for the weapons. So we've seen different Scandinavian countries give money so that Ukraine can make those weapons. And I think there's going to be increasing pressure on Europe to provide that cash so that Europe can make the weapons in the country.
Melinda, before we let you go, a quick one on what some analysts have been saying. They're saying that this is the phone call, and if nothing is achieved with this phone call, nothing is going to be achieved ever, and the whole thing is going to fall apart, and the war will grind on with, of course, the more severe consequences than those we've seen before. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes and no. So I think the war will grind on. I don't expect anything grand to come out of this phone call. I see Donald Trump going through the evolution that every American president, except for Joe Biden, has gone through of the American modern presidents who's dealt with Putin. They come in optimistic and think that, oh, I can turn him, I can build a relationship with him in the way my predecessor couldn't. And they come to see that Putin is untrustworthy and that he breaks his word. And we see a hardening of their position. I think that's what's happening with Trump now. But I think that it's too neat to say that something has to happen at this phone call. The reason I say that is Trump cannot walk away from Ukraine. He has not had any serious foreign policy wins. He does not want another Afghanistan, and he's sensitive to that. He may grow impatient. He may walk away for a bit of time. But if he does try to walk away and the situation worsens in Ukraine, I think he will be drawn back in for legacy reasons, and because frankly, all of America's friends in Europe will be demanding American attention.
All right, Melinda, appreciate your time. Melinda Haring, the Senior Fellow, Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council.